Here is your fully rewritten, original version of this story, following your exact structure and formatting rules. Today was my daughter's birthday, and I walked into her office building holding a bundle of sunflowers. And the moment I stepped through those glass doors, I heard a voice screaming, "How dare a filthy little nobody like you touch my things?" Through a gap in the frosted glass wall, I saw my own daughter on her knees, sobbing, and when I turned to see who was screaming at her, my blood turned to ice, because that woman was my wife. Asterisk asterisk. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to explain how that morning actually began, because it matters more than you would think. The sunflowers cost me $11 from a street cart near downtown. My daughter, Josie, had loved sunflowers since she was 4 years old, ever since her mother, Eleanor, planted a whole row of them along the back fence of our old house. Eleanor died 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, and nothing about the empire I had built with my own 2 hands ever prepared me for watching the person who held my entire life together disappear that fast. This particular morning was not about grief, though. It was about surprising my daughter at work on her birthday, and nothing more. I wore an old faded field jacket, the kind with a frayed collar, bought decades earlier at an army surplus store the year I left the service. My assistant of 11 years, a man named Owen Pierce who had served alongside me before either of us ever wore a suit, raised an eyebrow at the jacket and reminded me I owned 3 tailored suits hanging untouched in my closet. I told him I was well aware. He understood, the way he always understood, that some mornings call for the version of yourself that existed long before the money did. Josie had taken a design internship at Lumiere Fashion House 8 months earlier without telling me until after she had already accepted the offer, because that was simply who she was. She never once used my last name in a professional setting. As far as anyone at that company knew, she was a 23-year-old intern from a modest background, extremely talented, extremely private about her personal life, and I respected that decision completely, never once interfering. I parked 2 blocks from the building that morning, signed in as a surprise visitor at the front desk, and rode the elevator up to the 4th floor with a stupid, hopeful grin on my face like a man half my age. That is when I first heard the voices coming from behind the frosted glass doors of the design department. One voice sharp and trained to cut without needing volume. The other voice small and quiet. The sound of someone holding something unbearable very, very still. "Look at yourself," the sharp voice said. "A broke little nobody from nowhere. You actually believed you had the right to touch this collection." Then the voice rose even louder. "How dare a filthy little nobody like you put your hands on my things?" I leaned toward the narrow gap in the doorframe, and there she was, my wife, Catherine, standing tall in a designer coat, and beside her stood her daughter from a previous marriage, a woman named Bree, arms folded, watching my daughter with lazy, cruel amusement dancing across her face. "Mom, she is so slow," Bree said, examining her manicured nails without even glancing down. "They really will hire anyone these days." Catherine made my daughter pick up scattered portfolio pages off the marble floor 1 page at a time, on her knees, while Bree laughed and called it fitting punishment for someone with her background. Then Catherine delivered what I can only describe as the real blow of the entire performance. I'm going to gently suggest that perhaps this internship simply is not the right fit for someone like her. And as the 2 of them turned to walk away, Bree swept the neatly res-tacked pages right back onto the floor with the careless back of her hand, muttering the word "oops" as if it were the funniest thing she had said all week. I did not walk through that door. Instead, I stepped back into a small alcove near the elevator bank and let the 2 of them pass within 8 feet of me without ever noticing I was there. Then I stood in silence and watched my daughter, completely alone now, pick up those same scattered pages a second time, while 2 other staff members who had clearly witnessed the entire cruel display simply stared down at their own shoes and did absolutely nothing to help her. Something inside my chest did not tear that day. It shattered completely into something far colder and far more permanent than ordinary rage. It became a decision, a quiet, unshakable decision. And here is exactly what I understood standing frozen in that hallway watching my grown daughter cry alone on a marble floor on her birthday. This had not been some random coincidence at all. Catherine had scheduled appointments, brought along a prepared portfolio, dressed Bree specifically for the occasion. She had chosen my daughter's birthday deliberately, for maximum emotional damage, and that meant this entire humiliation had been carefully planned in advance. I set the sunflowers down gently at the base of the building entrance and called Owen immediately. "Pull everything you can find on Lumiere Fashion House," I told him, "and find out exactly how long Catherine has known Josie works there, not simply when she found out, but how long she has known this and deliberately said absolutely nothing to me about it." By the time I made it back to my house that evening, Owen was already seated at my kitchen table, surrounded by 3 full legal pads of dense handwriting. What he had uncovered in just 3 hours made me genuinely wish he had found nothing at all. Catherine had known about Josie's job for at least 3 full weeks, confirmed by a lunch meeting she had quietly arranged with the company director, paid for directly through our shared household account, followed just 2 days later by an unannounced private appointment she had never once mentioned to me. Worse than that, over the past 22 months, systematic transfers had been quietly bleeding out of our joint accounts, each transfer small enough to avoid triggering automatic bank review, adding up over time to nearly $840,000, funneled directly into a shell company registered in Nevada and a separate personal account held under Bree's own name. In this state, moving marital assets like that against a spouse over the age of 65 is legally classified as financial elder abuse, plain and simple. And my own longtime estate attorney of 4 years, a man named Preston Wade, had been quietly billing Catherine on the side for something vaguely coded on the invoices as document preparation services. In plain honest language, he had been secretly helping her draft an entirely new version of my will behind my back. Then Owen told me the one detail that made the entire room go completely silent around us. My recent blood work from earlier that summer had shown certain markers my own doctor had simply blamed on ordinary aging. Owen had quietly asked a toxicologist friend of his to take a closer look at those same results, and that friend explained those exact markers could just as easily indicate prolonged low-dose sedative exposure over an extended period of time. I immediately thought about the glass of red wine Catherine poured for me every single night without fail, always from a bottle she personally opened herself, always handed directly into my own hand. I thought about the slight tremor I had recently noticed in my fingers, which I had simply written off as another unfortunate sign of getting older. That night, I sent Josie a simple text message. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I love you more than you know." She sent back a single sunflower emoji, followed by 3 quiet words, "Love you too, Dad." She had absolutely no idea what I now knew, and I fully intended to keep it that way until the exact moment I was finally ready to move. I did not sleep at all that night. Early the next morning, I drove down the coast to a private clinic and personally gave blood to a toxicologist named Dr. Bellamy, someone completely outside my usual circle of contacts. While I was driving back home along the coastal highway, a nurse from the hospital called my phone directly. Josie had been in a serious car accident on a steep hillside road, struck violently from behind by an SUV that never once stopped to check on her. She was alive, thankfully, with bruised ribs, a sprained wrist, and a deep gash above her eyebrow. But she was alive, and that single fact was the only thing keeping me upright at that moment. Sitting beside her hospital bed a short while later, I gently asked her to tell me the complete truth about everything, and what came pouring out of her was not simply about the accident itself. Her laptop had mysteriously gone missing 2 full weeks earlier. Her car had been deliberately keyed while parked in the company garage. Someone had anonymously reported her to Human Resources for theft just 3 days before the accident occurred. She told herself repeatedly that she was simply being paranoid about all of it. She was not being paranoid at all. That same afternoon, Dr. Bellamy called me directly with the completed toxicology results. The substance was a prescription sedative present in a very specific pattern, consistent with somewhere between 4 and 8 months of deliberate, carefully controlled dosing. This was absolutely not an accident of any kind. Someone had been quietly feeding it to me in amounts small enough to avoid raising suspicion, yet large enough to keep me compliant, more suggestible, and far less likely to question things happening right in front of me, less likely to push back against someone I had trusted completely with my entire life. That same day, Owen managed to pull traffic camera footage from near the accident site, and it clearly showed a dark gray SUV rented that same morning from a rental company under a name that simply did not check out. paid for using a card that traced directly back to the exact same Nevada shell company that had been quietly draining our accounts for nearly 2 years. I called Owen immediately and gave him 3 clear instructions. Freeze every single joint account Catherine could possibly access before the business day officially closed. Find me a family law attorney with absolutely zero prior connection to my existing legal team, and he already had someone in mind. A formidable woman named Catherine Doyle, widely considered the very best in the entire state. And finally, quietly remove every bottle of wine from that house before Catherine came home, without giving her the slightest reason to suspect why. Then I personally went to see my longtime executive assistant, a woman named Dolores Finch, who had worked faithfully by my side for 12 full years. It turned out she had been quietly coerced the entire time. Bree had dug up an old, already fully repaid financial mistake involving Dolores's own son and had used it as leverage, forcing Dolores to secretly hand over my private calendar and confirm exactly where Josie worked. To her enormous credit, Dolores had firmly refused to hand over my private medical portal credentials, which turned out to be the one single line she absolutely would not cross for anyone. She wrote out a full, detailed statement that very same night and personally called attorney Catherine Doyle before she finally allowed herself to sleep. The following morning, Owen arrived at my door carrying a thick envelope and wearing the exhausted face of a man who clearly had not slept at all. Her legal name is not actually Catherine Holt, he told me quietly, sitting down across from me at the table. Her real name is Vera Kowalski, born decades earlier in an entirely different state, and none of the polished background story she had told everyone for years was real in any way. She had carefully built this entire false identity roughly 20 years ago and had been living comfortably inside it ever since. There had been 2 previous marriages under that exact same false identity, one involving a wealthy developer who had lost over $2 million, and another involving a respected surgeon who had died suddenly of a cardiac event just 14 months into their marriage, an estate later bitterly contested by his own grown children. A marriage built entirely on top of a fabricated identity is not simply grounds for an ordinary divorce in this state. It is grounds for a full legal annulment, meaning the marriage would be treated as though it had never legally existed in the first place. No community property division whatsoever. Everything would remain entirely mine. There was one final photograph tucked inside that same envelope, security footage pulled from a storage room clearly showing Bree herself deliberately cutting the seam of an extremely expensive gown, the very same gown she and Catherine had been secretly planning to publicly blame on my innocent daughter. A second image from the parking garage showed Bree tampering directly with the brake sensor housing on Josie's car, just 3 days before the accident that put my daughter in the hospital. That was the final piece of evidence I needed. I immediately called Douglas Kane, the majority shareholder of Lumiere Fashion House, and purchased his entire 40% stake outright that same afternoon, offering a generous 15% premium in cash, no conditions attached whatsoever. By just after 3 o'clock that same day, I personally owned 60% of the very company that had allowed my own daughter to be quietly tortured for months on end. Nobody inside that building would know a single thing about it until it was already far too late to matter. I brought absolutely everything I had gathered directly to Detective Marcus Riley, including the toxicology report, the complete financial trail, the surveillance photographs, and Dolores's fully signed statement. He personally confirmed the brake sensor tampering through forensic analysis and drafted formal arrest warrants, vehicular assault with intent for Bree, and criminal poisoning combined with elder financial abuse for Catherine. I gave him one final crucial piece of information, exactly where both women would be the following evening, the company's glamorous annual gala. I went straight to visit Josie in the hospital to tell her everything. And that is exactly when my own daughter told me something that stopped me completely cold in my tracks. 7 full months earlier, she had accidentally stumbled onto an email thread on our shared cloud storage account, a rough draft of my will that cut her out entirely, redirecting my entire estate toward Catherine and a newly created trust in Bree's name instead. She genuinely did not know at the time whether I had personally requested those changes myself. She never wanted to become the daughter who accused her own father's wife without solid proof in hand. So instead of confronting either of us directly, she had quietly begun documenting everything on her own, my noticeably slowed reactions, my strangely repeated phrases, our nightly wine ritual. And back in February, she had personally called Owen with an unexplained hunch urging him to check my blood for possible sedatives. And that single hunch became the very seed of everything Owen later independently confirmed on his own. She had also overheard Bree casually mention her exact workplace by name at a family dinner months earlier, and understood in that instant that Bree had known precisely where she worked and had deliberately chosen to say nothing about it, which told her absolutely everything she needed to know about what was quietly coming her way. She had been keeping a detailed notebook locked inside her office locker at Lumiere, never at her own apartment, because she correctly suspected someone might eventually search her home while she was away. My own daughter had been quietly running her own parallel investigation for a full 7 months, protecting me from her own fears the entire time, in exactly the same way I had been protecting her from mine. We have apparently been running the exact same operation from 2 completely different ends, she said softly from her hospital bed. I think it is finally time we compared our notes. The gala took place the very next evening. I wore the same black suit Eleanor had personally helped me choose years earlier, and 400 guests filled the grand ballroom that night. Owen had already arranged for Detective Riley's officers to be quietly positioned in plain clothes throughout the room, blending seamlessly into the crowd. At exactly 7:40 that evening, Catherine walked confidently onto the stage completely uninvited and publicly accused an unnamed intern of deliberately destroying a priceless designer gown. Bree leaned eagerly into the microphone and loudly asked how a complete nobody like Josie had ever been trusted with something so valuable in the first place. 400 faces immediately turned toward my daughter's table in stunned silence. I stood up slowly, walked directly to the stage, and calmly took the microphone from Catherine's manicured hand. "My name is Nathaniel Cross," I announced to the entire room, "and I am Josie Cross's father." I told the stunned crowd slowly, and without a trace of anger in my voice, that the woman who had just spoken was not actually named Catherine Holt at all, that her real legal name was Vera Kowalski, that her entire polished background had been completely fabricated from the start, and that the formal annulment paperwork had already been filed that very same morning. I told them plainly about the $840,000 quietly funneled through a Nevada shell company over nearly 2 years. I held up the security, still showing Bree herself cutting the gown with her own 2 hands. I told them the company director had secretly been paid $60,000 from that exact same shell company to guarantee my daughter's evaluations tanked, and her position quietly became untenable. And I informed them that as of the previous afternoon, I personally owned 60% of the very company they were all currently standing inside. Bree immediately bolted for the nearest exit and walked directly into a waiting officer's path. Detective Riley climbed the stage steps carrying the formal warrants in hand. I said just one single word to Catherine, her real name, Vera, spoken quietly, directly in front of every single camera in that packed room, and I watched 20 entire years of careful construction finally come apart right there on her face. Preston Wade, clearly panicking amid the chaos, approached Owen and desperately tried to negotiate some kind of deal, and in doing so accidentally handed him a fully recorded confession in the process. I walked Josie carefully up onto that stage, gently wrapped my arm around her still healing bruised ribs, and told all 400 guests exactly who she truly was. A talented honors graduate who had earned her position entirely on her own merit without ever once using my name, who had been cruelly humiliated inside that very building and put in a hospital bed by people standing in that room, and who was also, as it happened, the sole heir to absolutely everything I owned. Later that same night, Catherine asked to see me privately from her holding cell without her lawyer present. I chose not to go inside, but I stood quietly outside the small window and watched her sit completely alone, still wearing her elegant gown, her face finally undirected, no longer performing for anyone at all, simply tired in a way that looked genuinely real for what felt like the very first time in years. The intake officer later told me she had said just one single thing when she was first brought in. "I never planned to stay this long." I never got a clean answer for exactly what that meant, and honestly, some things simply never resolve cleanly. You just eventually learn to carry them quietly with you. Bree ultimately accepted a plea deal, receiving 2 years in state custody, full restitution payments, and a permanent restraining order against contacting our family ever again. Catherine received 18 months suspended down to 2 years of closely supervised probation, full restitution of every dollar she had taken, and mandatory counseling sessions. The company director kept her position only long enough to formally apologize to my daughter's face before my attorneys quietly handled the rest of the fallout. Dolores's earlier coercion was formally and officially recognized by the court. Her personal record remained completely clean, and she was back at her desk the very next Monday morning with the coffee already freshly poured, exactly as always. Josie eventually returned to Lumiere, not as an intern this time, but as Director of Creative Development, reporting directly to the board itself, on one single condition she insisted upon entirely herself. No favors of any kind, no special adjustments whatsoever. She would earn every single bit of it exactly the same way as before. Months later, in the quiet chill of December, I drove past that same familiar street vendor and bought 2 fresh bunches of sunflowers. I brought them directly to her office, where the very first bunch from her birthday still sat dried and gently curled inside a coffee mug on her desk, exactly where she had left them. "She keeps them until they are completely finished," she told me softly with a small smile. I sat across from my daughter in that very same room where all of it had first begun, bathed in soft December light, and quietly told her about that very first morning. I spent nearly 2 entire years trusting a carefully constructed performance instead of simply watching the pattern unfolding right in front of me. Trust without genuine discernment is not really a virtue at all. It is simply vulnerability wearing a well-tailored suit. If you take just one single thing away from everything I have shared with you today, let it be this simple truth. The people standing closest to you are not automatically the people who are actually safest for you to trust completely. Watch closely what they choose to protect. Watch closely what they choose to hide. Watch closely what quietly happens to the people they claim to love the moment they believe no one important is actually watching. I made nearly every single mistake a father possibly can make, except for one final mistake I refused to make. I never stopped fighting for my daughter until it was truly too late. I was fortunate enough to reach her in time before the damage became permanent and irreversible. Not everyone gets that same fortunate outcome, and that single truth is exactly why I choose to share this story with you today.